I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcome to this episode of To the Contrary podcast. I mean, damn, you wanted it to live in interesting times? Look at this. We have troops in the streets of Los Angeles, a big, beautiful military parade that will be taking over Washington, D.C. and shutting down the airport for the whole day. We have mass No Kings rallies all across the country, a hot war between Israel and Iran. Where do we begin? With my good friend, Tom Nichols, staff writer for The Atlantic. How are you, first of all, Tom?
Exhausted, Charlie, but I'm well. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, and we're recording this on Friday the 13th, as if it couldn't be any better. Okay, so I want to actually start with some of the bottom feeding stories of the day, because, it's obvious we could start with Israel, or we could talk about, L.A. I want to talk about, this. It feels like a blast from the past. It feels like something from Trump 1.0. Corey Lewandowski. Do you remember Corey Lewandowski? The guy who was
my fellow masshole. But
he is definitely you want to talk about a guy that he must have like 20 lives, because he's been disgraced and fired and whatever. One of Trump's thugs from like the beginning, right? But apparently he's still very, very tight with Kristi Noem. Apparently, there was a lot of talk that they were kind of whatever. He's apparently hanging around with her. Okay, the reason I'm bringing him up. Okay, so we had this incident where Senator Alex Padilla tries to ask a question of Kristi Noem at a press conference in California, the state he represents in the United States Senate. He is manhandled, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed. It is a shock, and it is an outrage. Now, of course, MAGA never apologizes for anything, and they're trying to defend it. And you have Mike Johnson, the deplorable speaker, saying that Padilla should be the one who should be censured. But I think one of the dazzling details of the story, Tom, is the one guy who knew how fucked up it was Corey fucking Lewandowski. That it turns out that it was Corey, that while you have these FBI agents swarming over this United States senator and Padilla going, what's happening? Why are you arresting me? It's Corey Lewandowski who runs down the hall and says, let him go, let him go, let him know. So you know how fucked up it is when Corey fucking Lewandowski comes up and says, this is really fucked up. You know what I'm saying, Tom?
Yeah, I thought the same when I didn't, I came in late on the Padilla Noem story because, as you pointed out, there are a couple of things going on in the world, war. But I didn't catch the Lewandowski detail right. And then that was the first thing I thought. When you are too thuggish for Corey Lewandowski, maybe you should reconsider your life choices because that was just an incredible scene. It was shocking and appalling. And boy, when you can even Corey Lewandowski thinks, maybe you should lay off, the manhandling. That's quite something.
So. Yeah, here's a guy who's got a long history of that. He knows whereof he speaks when he talks about manhandling. Okay, so, in terms of like developing a BS meter for watching the defense and all of the spin on all of this, I proposed in my newsletter a thought experiment. There are people saying, well, they had no idea who this large Hispanic man was who was, trying to attack the Secretary of Homeland Security. He didn't identify himself. He didn't have the right pin on, as if nobody in the room would identify one of California's two United States senators. So here's the thought experiment. Just try to imagine Ron Johnson in Wisconsin being wrestled to the ground and handcuffed. Try to imagine Ted Cruz being wrestled to the ground in Texas and handcuffed. Actually, I'd like to sit on that one for a little while. But you can't. Or Tommy Tuberville in Alabama, trying to ask a question. Can you just imagine? None of that is remotely conceivable, is it?
No, and there's a couple of things to consider here. First of all, he's not just a senator; he was their Secretary of State. It's not like he's new to California.
Yeah, people knew who he was.
And let's just, before we talk about how completely ridiculous this is, let's point something else out, Charlie. I don't care who he was. If he was just a guy in the room, you still don't do that. It's worse that they manhandled the senator, but they shouldn't have treated anybody like that. You want to eject a heckler, then, fine, take him out of the room. Although I don't think Padilla was heckling. I think he was being rude or boorish, but, not a heckler. But the other thing is that isn't Padilla like on a committee that like has oversight here?
Yes.
And, she had to go through confirmation. So one of two things, either she knew who he was and she didn't say anything, or she's so
Yes.
bad at her job and so, in over her head that she couldn't recognize one of the two senators from the biggest state in the union who she has
Yeah.
had to talk to.
Well, it's always a mistake to overestimate Kristi Noem's intelligence. But a couple of things about a couple of people have pointed out, and I think this is relevant. It doesn't go to the heart of what they did there, but is relevant that right before he tried to ask her a question, a United States senator trying to ask her a question, she's giving some rant about how she is there to liberate Los Angeles from the socialists and whatever. It was like
Well, that's what set him off.
Well, I mean, it was sort of like we are here to take over the government, and like it's a coup. And I guess maybe we just sort of pass over how extreme those comments were, but also the I'm sorry, irony is dead. But the fact that she's accusing Padilla of engaging in political theater, this coming from Ice Barbie. I mean, Tom, really,
Well,
woman who dresses up.
And you're right. It let people skate past how both extreme and inane her comments were. And normally you would say, well, how seriously can you ever take Kristi Noem? Well, unfortunately, she's the Department of Homeland Security cabinet secretary. So you have to take it seriously. And when she basically said, yes, in fact, we are an occupying, basically played into the narrative of the protesters. Yes, in fact, we are an occupying force. Yes, we are here to overthrow the local authorities and to, rule as, rule from the Death Star. And it's just an incredible thing to say. I mean, these are things that would have been instantly disqualifying, that any president, who had a cabinet secretary and went to California and said, I'm here to liberate California from the socialists. The next thing would be, that she would be leaving public life to spend more time with her family. And instead,
with Corey,
Charlie. But, instead she did it because she was speaking to an audience of one, and to the stenographers at Fox. She did it. And it's almost like they're now just stringing together, that game where you just put magnets with words on your refrigerator, liberate, socialist, California occupiers.
I have that refrigerator.
You know what I'm saying? It's just, it's like, it's
Mad Libs.
It's MAGA Mad Libs at this point, but it's extremely dangerous to talk about the federal government. And by the way, you and I, old school, back in the day conservatives, when did conservatives become big fans of overwhelming federal power against states and localities? I mean, that seems to be a new wrinkle
when we are government. The jackbooted thugs. Remember when the NRA would say that we need to have guns because of these jackbooted thugs in the federal government, and now it's like, well, no, those are our jackbooted thugs. Okay, so bottom dwelling story of the. No, two more things. I always think that it's also helpful to talk about, alternative ways that everything could have turned out. First of all, disrupting press conferences to make political points is not unknown in American politics. And there are a number of ways of handling it. I mean, I can think of a half a dozen incidents. Sometimes you actually say, okay, well, you want to speak, you come up here, you talk. Or we had a couple of incidents here in Wisconsin where the person who was being disrupted was very well prepared, was able to answer the questions, was able to handle it. That could have easily been done. I think David mentioned that. The other alternative is that after it was clear that it was the United States Senator, they could have simply apologized and said this was a terrible misunderstanding, Senator. We are sorry. Get an apology from DHS. Get an apology from the FBI. And you just move past it. Of course, none of that happened, which tells you really how what a weird whirlwind. Okay, so another bottom dwelling story.
Apologizing, by the way, apologizing would have been the power move. I mean, it shows you also how insecure and weak these people are, that we're not going to apologize. We're not going to, to say, hey, don't worry. We're in charge. These people answer to me. Senator, I have my disagreements with you, but we apologize for the way you were treated. That would have been very much the kind of in charge control power move. And the other question I have before we leave this story is, how many security guys from how many different agencies does one meeting need? I mean, there were like 8 guys on him. I haven't seen the tape since early this morning, but it's like, what kind of weird, insecurity now is, because it was a federal building. People couldn't just walk in off the street.
Well, that's right. And Padilla has an office in that building, and he says that he was escorted into that room by an FBI agent, by a National Guard. I mean, none of it adds up. You also would think, you'd hope that there would be one senior security official who, once they realized it was a senator, would say to the other guys, okay, maybe we get him out of here, but we do not put him on the ground. We do not handcuff him. Anyway. Okay, so this whole thing is about illegal immigration, right? It's all about mass deportations, which Donald Trump is all in. Let me read you from Andrew Sullivan's letter this week. Just this week, Donald Trump even praised the millions of illegal immigrants in the agriculture and hospitality sectors, the domestic industries, along with construction, most responsible for exploiting cheap illegal labor. So you want to talk about an epic flip-flop. You want to talk about the mother of all tacos here. This is what Trump said. This is the anti-immigration, deport them all. He wrote, "Our farmers are being hurt badly. They have very good workers that have worked for them for 20 years. They're not citizens, but they've turned out to be great. And we're going to have to do something about that. We can't take all their people and send them back, and leisure too, and hotels." Oh my.
Wow,
Who's the squish now, Tom Nichols?
I was going to say, I mean, wow, Donald Trump channeling Liz Warren there or something. But you know what that really means, Charlie? You and I both know.
Yeah.
It means some rich guy who owns hotels called him up and said, "Dude, you're deporting my workforce, man. You're cutting them out. I'm not, what, you think I'm going to find Americans change bed sheets? Lay off." And so, of course, Trump people talk about this taco joke. Mm-hmm. The thing is, he doesn't back down to public opinion. He always reverses course when somebody rich or powerful calls him and says, stop messing with my rice bowl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's when he decides to back up.
I would have loved to have been in, whatever bat cave Stephen Miller hangs out with when this Truth Social post came out. If this had come from anyone else, that MAGA would have descended with all the flying monkeys on them. But, I once again recognizing that even though, Trump makes this his signature issue, that his principle is this thin, it's paper thin if you're watching him on YouTube. So Andrew Sullivan asks a great question. What the F is this really all about? Like the tariffs that gyrate and the spending cuts that don't cut spending and the great deals that turn out to be surrendered to China and the end of wars that never end and the executive orders that collapse of the first judicial review. So much of this is just theater. The real goal is to find illegal immigrants who can be associated with the left and the Democrats to gin up a conflict and to use it to smash and intimidate domestic opposition. Yes, that's what this is about. It's about state terror in the pursuit of ever greater executive power. And Tom, Andrew is not wrong, is he?
No, and it's ever greater executive power, not for some larger ideological project. I keep saying, Stephen Miller, Russ Vought, there's a few fanatics, in this administration. But by and large, it's extended power to keep your friends in power, keep looting the treasury, keep the grift and the corruption going. I mean, it's really just, it's kind of a ongoing corruption spree. I mean, in a way, I suppose that's a relief that this isn't really about anything. But it also suggests that, and I've said this about Los Angeles, I think Los Angeles is not about Los Angeles. It's about, and my friend and my colleague David Frum has brought this up as well. It's a dress rehearsal. It's, let's see how often I can put the military in the streets anytime I feel like it, because I might not want to leave office. I might not want my friends, in the Senate to get voted out of office in 2 years. And I think we can't have a failure of imagination about how dangerous and how determined some of these folks will be about this.
Well, you had a hell of a week, because you wrote, a couple of things, including, the fact that he is desensitizing Americans to, putting troops in city streets, but also that at the same time he appears to be hoping or trying to radicalize the troops. And I want to talk about
Yes.
his appearance at Fort Bragg, because you think about the alignment of the planets, the troops on the street of Los Angeles, his speech at Fort Bragg, where he encouraged the troops to boo his political enemies, and of course the big beautiful parade. You wrote "The Silence of the Generals." As President Trump crossed a dangerous line at Fort Bragg, the brass failed to speak out in the Army's defense. Now, you and I are on a little bit of a thread, and somebody said what a great piece you wrote, and you wrote back that you were writing angry, and I pointed out, Professor Nichols, you always write angry, but this one was furious, wasn't it? So talk to
That's
me
the
about
it's the Hulk's line,
the sound.
Dr. Banner, good time to get angry. That's my secret, Cap. I'm always angry.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
talk to me about Fort Bragg, and
there have been I would say there have been 3 times while Trump's been president, before and now, where I have felt physically ill watching, because we talk, oh, Trump makes me sick. No, listen, I'm a big boy. I worked in politics. I've seen a lot of bad stuff. There are only 3 times where I've literally felt like a kind of physical sense of revulsion. One was Helsinki in 2018, when Trump basically, stood there while Putin made him sit up and beg and roll over. The other was the White House meeting with Zelensky, where I felt my face growing hot with embarrassment, sympathetic embarrassment, at the shameful behavior of Trump and Vance. And the Fort Bragg thing was the third one. I spent, as you know, Charlie, I spent 25 years educating American military officers. This was a violation of every sacred tradition, every norm, and including a lot of Army regulations. That it was just sickening. It was obscene. The word I keep using over and over again, it was an obscenity what Trump did. And the fact that those young men and women behind him were encouraged, and apparently, I guess by some reporting, they were even picked. Like the rule was no Democrats and no fat kids, right?
Yeah.
No Dems, no fatties. And they were picked and encouraged to stand there and hoot and jeer a former commander in chief, a sitting governor, the mayor of our second largest city, the press, the people whose First Amendment freedoms they're supposed to be willing to die to protect. It was sickening, and that was only the third time in all these years where I watched it, and that's why that anger was. I had a little extra octane in it this time, because I literally felt sort of my stomach roil. Not at watching Trump. I mean, Trump's just does his usual clownery, but I was watching all of those uniformed Army people behind him, and I thought, this is the worst thing I have ever seen. And I've worked with the military for going on almost 30 years.
This has been a pattern. Trump can be outrageous, but the genuine outrage is often the reaction to it, is the failure to push back, to stand up, to say this was inappropriate. And the reality is that he's created this environment in which the generals know that if they do push back, if they do remind people about what the norms of the military are, they're out. They're gone. And so no one's going to stand up. And to the point about the radicalization of the military, I know that there's some wishful thinking out there that if Trump goes too far, that soldiers and generals will refuse to obey orders. You may be more optimistic about that, but I think that he is clearly trying to over a period of time transform the military culture, to eliminate all of those, not just the voices in the room who will tell him, no, Mr. President, you cannot use the Army to shoot protesters, but also the Army is not loyal to you, it's loyal to the country. I mean, I see him as part of this transformation of government, trying to groom the military to follow his will.
I remain optimistic because I've known so many people in our military. But I will tell you what shook me about Fort Bragg. For that to happen, there had to have been either the careerist cowardice and complicity of some of the officers, or there were officers who actually thought it was a good idea. And neither of those are good options, because in in any better America that existed before Donald Trump began this campaign of corroding our values, people would have been fired for this, like instantly. You know, the base. I mean, I don't know what the base commander's view on this is, but he's the base commander. He's the guy that takes the heat. If somebody set up a merch stand to sell
the merch
MAGA crap, on government property, someone needed to get fired for that, whether it's the base commander or some lower level officer who signed that piece of paper. That guy needs to get fired. And it bothers me to think that, and I name names in this, General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Army Chief of Staff, the base commander, either they're too scared to speak up or they agreed with it. And
the merch thing was a tell, wasn't it?
Yes, because you had to get permission to do that. And somebody at Fort Bragg said, sure, sell little cards that are called, little white privilege cards on government property.
This was one of those that I thought, no, that can't be true, right? That's going to be an urban legend that they're actually selling cards, a white privilege, what Trump is always right, or something like that. I mean, not ironic at all. No. And they allowed that. This is terrifying. Okay, so
let me just say, Charlie, when I would work at the Naval War College and I was writing articles that in my own name rather than as a government employee, people would call and say, you need to fire him. And they would have to literally check to see. I remember this. But they would check to say, when he wrote this, was he logged into his government computer? Did he do it on a government computer? Was he on government property? And of course, being fully aware of how the Hatch Act works, I never was. This is literally politicking on military property, things that any of us would have gotten fired for. And again, breach of Army regulations, against the law, someone needs to go. But apparently, again, either they agreed with it or they're too scared to speak up.
Have you read that new profile of Pete Hegseth, by the way? That's out there that I think, oh my God. So somebody's got to go.
But live your life so that no one ever writes a piece like that about you.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I know that probably a lot of our listeners have the sense that he is, in way over his head, that he is, one of the worst appointees. But trust me, whatever your imagination is, it falls short. What a silly, weak, dishonorable man this is. And so we talk about who is going to uphold discipline in the military. Well, this is Pete Hegseth's military right now.
You know what made me uncomfortable about that piece, Charlie? I have no particular love for any of the people that were involved in that story because they're all willing to work for Pete Hegseth. But to do that to one of your friends, this Caldwell fellow, you've been hired by a guy that you've known for years. You think you're friends. And you don't even get a call. Some guys just show up in your office and say, pack your stuff or you're out. And I thought, who does that? I mean, what is, over what? Over some sort of internal Pentagon pissing match, like as if the Pentagon's not in enough disarray to begin with. This is what you're spending your time doing, and you're doing it to your own friends.
I mean, it's hard to keep, sort of track and calibrate everything. I mean, you have the brutality, the cruelty, and then you have just so much of it is just pettiness, sheer bullshit pettiness, just pettiness. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in Los Angeles right now, because this is, of course, one of the dominant stories of the week, the substantive stories. The president, who I think is like 2 inches away from invoking the Insurrection Act, sends thousands of National Guard and federalizes the National Guard, and then also sends in 700 active duty Marines, despite not just the history, but rather clear black letter law, posse comitatus, that says you cannot use active military for law enforcement. So you wrote, Trump is using the National Guard as bait. Don't give him the pretext he wants. What were you warning about?
Donald Trump wants to draw the foul. He wants people to go into the streets, taunt these guys who, as one story pointed out today, these guardsmen and Marines who don't want to be there. They're not happy being. They don't want this mission. They don't want to be doing it. Trump wants the video, and he got it. I mean, look, however this ends,
Good.
Trump's gotten the images that he wanted. You have literally, burning cars. You have a row of kids facing off against the LAPD, waving Mexican flags.
Mhm.
Trump wants that narrative. He wants to say, see, I am protecting you. And this is not about California. Nobody in California is going to buy that. I mean, Californians are proud of their heritage. There's a lot of people in Los Angeles. He's reaching out to that disaffected group that's not quite MAGA, not willing to vote for Democrats, to say, just remember, no matter what they say about me, I'm the strong man protecting this country from a foreign invasion. And if you don't want, Lima, Ohio, or Springfield, Massachusetts, or wherever, to
Right.
become like Los Angeles, I'm the only thing that stands between this and you. And that's all he wants. Stephen Miller couldn't have stage managed some of those pictures better. And that's exactly what the trap he laid, and people walked right into it.
No, this is, and I do think that they're more, more and more people are realizing, look, these are creating ads for Donald Trump, and you have to decide, do you want to scratch your particular id, or do you actually want to, you know, successfully defied Trumpism. And quite frankly, and I got a lot of blowback on all of this, waving Mexican flags at American service members is not going to win hearts and influence people. It is not.
Look,
I tried to imagine the rallies on Saturday. If in fact you have mass rallies that are peaceful and lots of American flags and maybe the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, completely different image, and it'd be interesting to see how law enforcement reacts to that. But unfortunately, we also have this other pattern here, and I think we need to be honest about it. Yes, the vast majority of the protests are peaceful, but there are groups on the left as well as the right, but on the left, who come out at night, wear the masks and foment violence and justify the violence. And those people are Stephen Miller's fever dreams.
yeah.
And I'm absolutely convinced that in the Oval Office, they think this is an absolute stone cold winner for Donald Trump. Not sure that's the case. There's some polls that raise some questions about that, but there's a real downside risk for Democrats because of this long tradition of people siding with the forces of law and order if the protesters in fact do look like anarchists, violent anarchists.
My colleagues, John Lemire and some of our colleagues at the Atlantic, actually wrote a piece about this, saying the White House is delighted with this. And well, they should be, because it's not about winning the immediate fight about whether ICE can arrest people. It's about the long game of changing the public's perception. And I would also add, I think Trump wants to radicalize. This goes back to the Fort Bragg problem. Trump wants to radicalize those guys. He wants these young Marines and National Guardsmen who are like, what the hell am I doing here? He wants them to go home and say, you know what? It is pretty bad out there. And the best thing that could happen is if those guardsmen who live in California go home and say, I don't know what the hell this guy was thinking. It was fine. And there's kind of an ink spot strategy here of when those guys go home and say, listen, things were not that bad. That word spreads. But Trump and Miller want them to go home and say, some kid waved everybody can recognize the Mexican flag there, but there were other flags, there were Palestinian flags.
That was helpful.
Go home and say, some kid waved a flag I don't even recognize in my face and threw bottles at me. And that's like you say, that's their fever dream.
Well, I mean, you look at you want to talk about extreme rhetoric. I don't recommend that people do this on their own time, but if you just watch the social media posts of people like Stephen Miller, the language that they're using. I mean, Trump himself, keeps talking about using words like invaded and occupied. Miller, tweets out, look at all the foreign flags. Los Angeles is occupied territory. I mean, think about that. And then, of course, you have Kristi Noem, who does not know what habeas corpus is. This is how she describes sending Marines into Los Angeles. She wrote, "We are not going away. We are staying here to liberate the city from the socialists and the burdensome leadership this governor and this mayor have placed on this country and what they have tried to insert into the city." So she intends apparently to liberate the entire city from It's elected officials.
Yes.
Okay.
From its own
So
government.
this is not Fallujah. This is not
Right.
Baghdad. This is Los Angeles. So there are some polls that do suggest that maybe this is not the full-on winner that Trump thinks it is. But again, I don't think there should be any ambiguity on anybody's part. So what do you think about the whole Gavin Newsom thing? I am an extreme Gavin Newsom skeptic, but it did seem like, man, he's kind of finding his mojo right now. What do you think? You've been watching this guy. I think he's a bit much, but
well, like you, not a huge Gavin Newsom fan. Probably don't think that governor of California would be a good, from San Francisco, be a good presidential candidate, but he's saying the right things. He's acting like a governor and defending his prerogatives and saying, you can't just come in and take my National Guard and occupy, talk about liberating my, the biggest city in my state.
Yeah, and he does seem to be punching back. Okay, so let's get to the main event. I don't know what is the main event this week. Okay, actually, before the main event, by which I mean Israel and Iran. Your thoughts on the massive military parade? I mean, you've seen the pictures, you've seen the videos. They are extraordinary. This has been Donald Trump's, fantasy since term, since 1.0. It's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, taxpayers. But it is, and it's his birthday, and he wants to have that birthday celebrated with tanks and guns and rockets and missiles, the kind of thing that we generally haven't done in this country. So talk to me about that.
Well, again, Trump is trying to acclimate us to that, but also that's what he thinks that's what the military's for. He thinks the military is toy soldiers who should salute him and call him sir and make him feel grand about himself, unless, of course, you're talking about the soldiers who sacrifice for their country, and those guys are just losers. And
they're the suckers,
But
this is by the graves.
It's in front of a gravesite. It's incredible. But it's un-American. It's a violation of our civil military traditions, and the founder of the American Army, George Washington, would probably be appalled at all of this. It's horrifying.
Okay, so let's get to the main event. And again, I think just the conjunction of all the planets, the world is right now on the brink of really dangerous disaster, and Donald Trump is focused on, of course, internal enemies. At the very moment when he has American soldiers in American cities, we are seeing some really dangerous moments. You've written about this: Israel's bold, risky attack. The Israeli campaign may be necessary, but preventive wars, and we can talk about that word, preventive wars carry great moral and practical risk. So talk to me about that, Tom, because you turned out this piece. This is bold, it's risky. First indications are, and again, all the caveats about the fog of war would suggest this has been very, very, very successful, but we're just on day one. So talk to me about this.
Well, the Israelis are claiming it's preemptive, that they had to stop an immediate threat. Yeah. I don't think that's true, but that doesn't mean also that it's wrong for them to go after this Iranian program. But preventive wars, which are wars of choice, they're done by discretion. They're done on your own timetable. As we learned the hard way in Iraq, carry a lot of risk, a lot of moral and strategic risk. And I worry about that because, once you take a bite of that sandwich, you're going to have to eat the whole thing. You don't have the presumption of self-defense. You don't have the presumption that you are imminently, going to be the victim of an attack. So, I hope they know what they're doing. But this is a really dangerous moment. And again, doesn't mean that the Israelis shouldn't have done it, but it's that rationale I think doesn't work.
All right. Well, we'll talk more about this later because I think it is important to figure out what is going on. Tom Nichols, thank you so much for joining us this week on this extraordinary weekend. And thank you all for watching this episode of To the Contrary podcast. We do this, as you know, to remind ourselves that we are not crazy.